Jeremiah Duggan was a young Londoner studying in Paris who became politically engaged in the run-up to the Iraq War. In January 2003, while heading to the University of London Institute in Paris, he was handed a copy of Nouvelle Solidarité, the newspaper of the Solidarité and Progress Party, by one of its own writers. When he learned that the party took a strong, principled stand against the Iraq War, Duggan began joining them at anti-war protests. Before long, he was invited to a Schiller Institute conference near Wiesbaden, the movement's European headquarters. He stayed in a hotel with 2 other party members and attended the various talks. The ideas presented there were decidedly unorthodox. To give you a sense of the atmosphere, here's a summary of just one of the speeches. It opened with a discussion of a systematic plot by a cabal of British thinkers to destroy Europe's entire industrial capacity. Thinkers who had supposedly infiltrated and destabilized the Soviet Union. The speech then pivoted to Henry Kissinger's alleged plan for genocide in Africa over overpopulation fears. Soon, it moved on to the nature of tragedy, arguing that a true Shakespearean tragedy always involves a person or population consenting to their own tragic fate. Every speech at the conference followed a similar pattern. Attendees heard about British-American oligarchy's role in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the secret British drug trade and its connections to the hippie and free love movements, and even talks about Nietzschean Jews who supposedly wanted to join the Nazi Party and ignite a Third World War. Captivated by these sweeping and unusual ideas, Duggan decided to join the LaRouche youth movement. He moved into one of their cadre schools in Wiesbaden, living alongside 60 to 70 other young recruits. His new daily routine involved singing in a choir and taking intensive classes on mathematics, science, and economics. But Duggan had a problem. He was both Jewish and British. The movement regarded both the Jews and the British with deep suspicion. As a result, he was put through the ringer. What happened next remains disputed. The following account is carefully pieced together from eyewitness testimonies and investigative reports. On the night of March 26, 2003, at around 4:20 a.m., Duggan called his girlfriend. He told her he was under too much pressure. He spoke quietly and made paranoid-sounding claims about experiments with computers and magnetic zones. A separate witness reported that Duggan suddenly left the house running after setting off an alarm. He then called his mother in a highly distressed state. He told her he was in big trouble, mentioned Nouvelle Solidarité, and said, "I want out." In a second call, he said, "I'm frightened," and "I want to see you now," before the line went dead. The following day, Jeremiah Duggan was killed in a collision, or series of collisions, on a major road near Wiesbaden. The initial German investigation treated the death as suicide by running into traffic. However, because full police files and autopsy records were never made fully available, Duggan's family fought for years to reopen the case. They argued that his final phone calls showed not suicidal intent, but raw terror of some outside threat. They also highlighted serious flaws in the investigation, including the failure to preserve key evidence like his clothing and shoes, and major gaps in witness statements about the final 24 hours. After a long legal battle, on May 20th, 2010, UK officials reopened the inquest. They ultimately ruled that Jeremiah Duggan's death was not a suicide. To understand how a promising young student like Jeremiah could be drawn so deeply into this world, and why the movement regarded him with such suspicion, we need to understand the man who created it. This is the story of one of America's most original political cult leaders, his rise, his fall, and his afterlives. This is the story of Lyndon LaRouche. The subjects we examine on Zipgeist often fall outside the bounds of what YouTube considers advertiser-friendly, and demonetization is an ongoing reality of covering them honestly. That is where Patreon becomes essential. If you would like to support the continued production of these documentaries, 2 membership tiers are currently available. Initiate, $3 per month. It includes access to the Patreon chat and an early viewing of new releases. Adept, $6 per month. It includes the same benefits, along with a personal shout-out at the end of the video. The link is in the description below. Contributions of any size make a meaningful difference in keeping this work independent and ongoing. Thank you, and we'll return to the video momentarily. Lyndon LaRouche Jr. was born on September 8, 1922, in Rochester, New Hampshire. Raised by strict Orthodox Quaker parents, his father, a converted Catholic, and his mother from an evangelical background. He described his childhood as that of a nasty duckling. Socially isolated and precocious, he learned to read at 5. His parents' rigid rules, especially the ban on fighting back against bullies, made his early years miserable, while their ferocious sectarianism, accusing fellow Quakers of Bolshevism and embezzlement, filled the home with bitterness and conspiracy theories. Despite preaching nonviolence, the LaRouches waged war on their own Quaker community, opposing liberal funds and even praising anti-Jewish views. Young Lyndon found brief escape with his minister grandfather, who sparked his interest in biblical theory. But in high school, he withdrew into philosophy, Descartes, Leibniz, and Kant, building deep resentment towards peers and the education system he blamed for his isolation. Kant led him to question his parents' faith and their plan for him to become a minister, though he still backed their sectarian battles. In 1942, LaRouche entered a conscientious objector camp, but soon rebelled and enlisted in the army, serving in the China-Burma-India theater. There, he flirted with communism, later offering conflicting stories about becoming a Trotskyist. One of the most bizarre stories of that time involved LaRouche attempting to organize GIs, with little success, in joining the Burmese Communist Party. Discharged in 1946, he briefly tried college again, but quit in disgust. In 1949, amid the Red Scare, he joined the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party under the pseudonym Lynn Marcus, worked in a GE factory, moved to New York, married, and fathered a son, while growing frustrated with the party's limits. By the early 1960s, bored with consulting work and factional infighting, LaRouche experienced his own intellectual breakthrough in theory. Convinced no real revolutionary movement would arise, he returned to older texts he read as a boy to forge revisions to standard Marxist theory. The first reference was to Book 3 of Plato's Republic. In that dialogue, Socrates discusses the kind of founding myth that could sustain a just city-state. The myth has 2 main parts. First, a story of common birth from the earth. Second, a story of different natural kinds, symbolized by metals. Socrates says that the citizens are to be told that their upbringing was like a dream, and that in truth they were formed beneath the ground until the earth, their mother, brought them forth. Because of this, they must treat the land as their mother and their nurse, and regard one another as brothers and children of the self-same earth. Although all are siblings, God has mixed different metals into people. Those fitted to hold rule have gold, auxiliaries have silver, and the farmers and craftsmen have iron and brass. The first element of the myth provides a sense of unity. Everyone in the city belongs to one family. The second provides an account of diversity and hierarchy within society, allowing different roles to be filled. Although this element of the Republic was not adopted by historical city-states, similar patterns appeared in various religions and esoteric movements throughout history. For example, in the 2nd century AD, the Gnostic Christian sect known as the Valentinians taught that there were three kinds of people: material men, who would never come to the knowledge of their mysteries and therefore could not be saved; psychic men, who were to follow the law and could dwell in a lesser heaven with the redeemed demiurge at the end of days; and spiritual men, who could rise above the law and commune with the highest gods in the pleroma, or highest heavens. LaRouche, taking a cue from these kinds of elitist frameworks, often emphasized his need for men with golden souls, not merely members of the proletariat, but intellectually curious would-be philosopher kings who could form the core of his movement. In the mid-1960s, as the Vietnam War protest intensified and the New Left surged through anti-war demonstrations and a growing fascination with figures such as Che Guevara and Mao, Lyndon LaRouche saw an opportunity. The aging Trotskyist sensed real revolutionary possibility and made his first serious power move outside the Socialist Workers' Party by targeting the tiny American Committee for the Fourth International. He plotted daily with its leader, Tim Wohlforth, traveled to Montreal for secret unity talks with the British radical Jerry Healy, and dreamed of chairing a newly fused revolutionary party under the so-called Montreal Concordat. Healy quickly crushed the scheme and forced LaRouche out, but the encounter taught him important lessons. He saw Healy use goon squads, public humiliation, and psychological pressure to break and control followers. LaRouche later claimed that he had resisted this through sheer charisma and intellect, concluding that Trotskyism was dead, and any real movement would have to be built from scratch. He began teaching intense Marxist classes through the Free School of New York, drilling students in Hegel, Kant, Leibniz, and all three volumes of Das Kapital in order to forge an elite intellectual vanguard of golden souls. During this same period, Students for a Democratic Society grew rapidly as a center of the anti-war movement and campus left. Within it, however, the more radical Maoist faction, the Progressive Labor Party, or PLP, became especially useful. PLP members generally had two options. One was to spend a year undercover in a blue-collar job, trying to unionize workers and recruit party members from the industrial working class. The other was to spend a year studying Marx, Engels, and the so-called classics of Marxism-Leninism. Most members, being idealistic college art students, chose the latter. Because LaRouche was already known as a lecturer and teacher of Marxist thought, he became a popular choice among students pursuing this path. During this time, LaRouche wrote a 500-page book on his interpretation of Marxist economics titled Dialectical Economics, an introduction to Marxist political economy. Although he did not necessarily agree with everything in the book throughout his later life, many of its more novel insights became standard features of his later economic thought. The opening of the book deals with the methodology of economics and argues that Marx broke with certain older geometric assumptions in a way comparable, in LaRouche's teachings, to the break made by thinkers such as Kepler and Newton with older modes of thought represented by Euclid. Euclid might say that a line is simply an infinite collection of points, but a point itself has no breadth, depth, or width. If one were to keep doubling the number of points placed next to each other, one would still never produce a line, because an infinite multiplication of dimensionless points does not generate extension. LaRouche uses this sort of paradox to criticize the economics of his own time, which assumed that one could model the economy simply by adding up all the individual actors and predicting how they would behave under constraints. He contrasts this with an approach that studies the economy as a whole, and only afterwards compares the totality to the actions of its parts. The next part of the book turns to basic Marxist economic theory. Marx wrote extensively, but the core idea could be stated briefly. He believed that the value of the economy could ultimately be measured in terms of the socially necessary labor time required to produce its goods and services. For Marx, this was important because it helped explain a dynamic he believed he saw clearly in capitalism. Competition and innovation tend over time to lower the rate of profit. That is, the return on investment relative to the assets invested by firms. The basic logic runs as follows. If socially necessary labor time determines the values of goods and services, then the value of those goods and services should fall as productivity rises and less labor time is required to produce them. A company that innovates can lower prices and become highly profitable, but once competing firms adopt the same innovations, they can recover lost market share. Over time, this leads to less profit relative to the total amount of capital invested, because less labor is required per unit of output as productivity rises. Marx called this the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And, viewed over very long periods, something like this does appear as a historical tendency in the global economy, even if Marx's specific explanation remains debated. LaRouche himself was less interested in this long-term tendency than the short-run fluctuations of GDP and the recurring waves of unemployment. In trying to explain these, he emphasized the lack of coordination within the economy and what he calls entropy, or the accumulation of mistakes that culminate in overstocking, widening gaps between market and book values, and rising costs. The counter to this, in his view, was the more intelligent and effective use of labor. He called the labor's stabilizing capacity to expand and reproduce those goods and services necessary for social life negentropy. When entropy rises, productive industries experience falling returns. As a result, more debt is taken on, and investments shift increasingly towards financial capital rather than productive capital, since the latter demands even more participation, while financial assets promise higher returns. Yet credit and financial assets ultimately depend on the viability and growth of the productive sectors of the economy. Eventually, these financial claims become overvalued, or defaults begin to rise, and the resulting bust produces a correction in financial markets and a drying up of cheap loanable funds. He often models this dynamic using a graph like this. The change in the growth of the physical or the productive output of an economy falls, while the change in the monetary and the financial aggregates rise. Eventually, because this is unsustainable, the growth of the financial aggregates falls and the physical economy's output falls due to the financial crisis. Using this theory of booms and busts, LaRouche became something of a doomsayer, speaking constantly about the irrationality of capitalism and the need for planning. This eventually led him to discussions of cybernetics. Cybernetics is the study of systems of control that operate through feedback loops. The clearest example is a thermostat. You begin by setting up a goal, namely keeping a room at a certain temperature. The thermostat then measures the room's actual temperature and decides whether to keep the heat or air conditioning on, depending on whether the target has been reached. The cycle repeats until the goal is met, and if the room's temperature changes again, the system readjusts. In socialist circles, cybernetics became a new model for how an economy might run efficiently without markets. It offered a way of thinking about how incentives and economy-wide planning could be adjusted under changing social conditions, so the plan could be revised until targets were met. However, LaRouche argued that cybernetic planning wrongly assumed that certain metrics could be statistically measured, when in fact they could not, especially human creativity, and that the theory failed to account for the full complexity of entropic systems. Many of LaRouche's students found these ideas compelling. They regarded him as a genius and looked up to him as a deeply committed political leader. Eventually, the students and LaRouche launched the SDS Transit Project and played a major role in the explosive 1968 Columbia University strike, occupying buildings and influencing the steering committees while the PLP leadership fumed from the sidelines. When the PLP expelled its own defectors, LaRouche's group operated independently as the SDS Labor Committee and helped tip the balance in the bitter 1969 SDS convention split. By 1973, He had rebranded his followers as the National Caucus of Labor Committees, with over 600 hardcore members in 25 cities, their own newspaper, New Solidarity, and a growing European network. Inside the NCLC, members dropped out of school and lived for the coming revolution. LaRouche filled the organization with paranoia, teaching that the Rockefeller family controlled the CIA and was plotting nuclear holocaust, while the tiny NCLC alone could save the world. By 1973, tensions between Lyndon LaRouche's National Caucus of Labor Committees and the Communist Party USA had reached a boiling point. After the Communist Party tried to sabotage LaRouche's National Conference for welfare recipients and the unemployed in Philadelphia, he decided it was time for war. In a fiery emergency meeting, LaRouche declared that the NCLC would no longer tolerate opposition. "From here on in," he announced, "the Communist Party cannot hold a meeting on the East Coast. We'll mop them up in 2 months." He promised his followers total hegemony over the American left. LaRouche launched Operation Mop Up, a ruthless campaign of physical attacks on rival leftist organizations. NCLC members were organized into flying squads trained in street fighting. They stormed meetings armed with metal pipes, clubs, and nunchucks. The violence spread rapidly from New York to Philadelphia, Buffalo, Detroit, and other cities. Several people were hospitalized with broken bones and serious injuries. As the attacks intensified, LaRouche turned his focus inward on his own members. He whipped up a climate of total hysteria by claiming there was an active assassination plot going against him. These psychological tactics broke down the remaining resistance among his followers and cut them off from reality and the outside world. Operation Mop Up succeeded in doing what LaRouche intended. It isolated the NCLC completely from the rest of the American left. Former rivals were now seen as permanent enemies, traitors, and obstacles to the revolution. Members who stayed through the violence became more fanatically loyal. The organization had crossed a point of no return. In the end, once LaRouche achieved his goal of total internal control, he declared victory and abruptly called off the campaign. Operation Mop Up had transformed the NCLC from just another radical leftist group into a tightly controlled, paranoid political machine, ready for whatever radical direction he chose next. In the summer of 1973, LaRouche launched a terrifying new phase inside the NCLC called ego stripping. He told his followers the biggest obstacle to becoming real organizers was their own psychosexual fears and bourgeois hang-ups. To destroy those weaknesses, he announced he would take away their bedrooms and personal lives forever, a form of cruel collectivism. "I am going to make you organizers by exposing the cruel fact of your sexual impotence," he declared. "I will destroy your rabbit holes, mental as well as physical, so you can never flee the terror of politics again." The sessions were brutal public confrontations. LaRouche or the group would pick a member at random and hammer them non-stop about every flaw in their behavior until they broke down sobbing. LaRouche called the hysterical crying an act of social love that liberated the real person. The paranoia exploded in January 1974 with the Great Manchurian Candidate Scare. It began when a German NCLC member named Konstantin George was supposedly drugged and brainwashed by East German secret police to assassinate LaRouche. Then came the main event: Christopher White, the young British husband of LaRouche's ex-partner Carol. On a flight to New York for an NCLC conference, White watched a movie and suddenly started shouting that the CIA planned to murder both his wife and LaRouche. Instead of calling a doctor, Carol called LaRouche, who rushed White into a non-stop deprogramming session at his apartment. What followed was pure theater of the grotesque. LaRouche's security team and a doctor joined in. Tapes later revealed White weeping, vomiting, begging for food and sleep while LaRouche tried to hypnotize him. The NCLC launched a massive publicity blitz, handing out thousands of flyers, issuing over 40 press releases in 2 weeks, filing a UN human rights complaint, and suing the CIA. LaRouche gave blood-curdling speeches describing exactly what the CIA supposedly did to victims: electric shocks, forced eating of human excrement, homosexual rape, and puppy-like whining to stop the pain. He screamed at his followers, "Any of you who say this is a hoax, you're cruds. You're subhuman. The human race is at stake." The hysteria consumed the entire organization. Members begged to be deprogrammed, terrified they too had been turned into Manchurian candidates with secret trigger words. One follower went berserk, screaming, "Cancel me! Cancel me!" and had to be hospitalized. Skeptics were branded brainwashed and targeted. Christine Burrell was accused of CIA control. Alice Weitzman was held captive in her apartment, blasting Beethoven in her room non-stop, only freed when police broke in after she threw a note out of her window. When security chief Jose Torres directly confronted White and learned the whole story was fake, LaRouche dismissed it as more brainwashing. By the end of the scare, anyone still in the NCLC was ready to believe absolutely anything LaRouche told them. In the early 1970s, as LaRouche steered the NCLC towards an explicitly anti-communist ideology, in doing so, he began to form multi-ethnic alliances. He studied groups like Rabbi Meir Kahane's Jewish Defense League, a violent Jewish gang tied to Israeli terror groups. He looked towards Joe Colombo's Italian-American Civil Rights League, a claimed civil rights group which was really an Italian-American political advocacy group, used to push agitprop denying the existence of various Italian mobs. He had discussions with George Wallace's followers, the staunch segregationist and populist governor of Alabama. Finally, he attempted to reach various black nationalist organizations. LaRouche argued these groups were the seeds of a new political movement that could unite under a populist banner of segregation. In the spring of 1973, LaRouche put the idea into action. He announced the Revolutionary Youth Movement, a paramilitary organization aimed at recruiting the most hardened black and Hispanic ghetto youth. He told his followers he would turn superfly street hustlers into enraged Prometheans who would seize control of America. College-educated black NCLC members, dressed in Black Panther-style leather jackets and sunglasses, fanned out into Bedford-Stuyvesant, Newark's Central Ward, and other poor neighborhoods. They linked up with the Outlaws, the biggest gang in Bed-Stuy, and began giving them classes in revolutionary theory and classical music. Yet, at the same time, the NCLC was launching savage racist attacks on black leaders. They terrorized meetings in Harlem, beat black Communist Party members on the street, and produced pamphlets branding poet-activist Amiri Baraka as Papa Doc Baraka, a mad dog, superfly, and an animal. One cartoon showed him as a hyena with drooling lips eating a baby's corpse. They even circulated terrifying leaflets about zebra killers, warning white New Yorkers that young black men with pinpoint eyes would jump them from cars and slash throats or smash children's heads on the pavement. While organizing these same ghetto youth, the NCLC ran editorials to white ethnic audiences, warning that their jobs would be stolen by welfare loafers and methadone-crazed dope fiend gang members. This double game opened the door to even stranger alliances. During this time, many segregationists and a minority of black nationalists would protest against the forced integration of black and white kids in what were called desegregating busing measures. In Boston, the NCLC traded intelligence with the stridently anti-busing Roar group and ran its own anti-busing congressional candidate. In Michigan, they nominated a Ku Klux Klan Great Night Hawk for state office and began an 11-year partnership with Pennsylvania Grand Dragon Roy Frankhauser. LaRouche's ideological reframing had worked. Black and white members could now attack black nationalists with a clear conscience, convinced they were fighting a deep state plot. The NCLC was no longer just another leftist sect. It had become a laboratory for building the very kind of multi-ethnic street force LaRouche had only theorized about. By 1975, the NCLC had begun openly cooperating with the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups. A secret internal memo justified the move as pure tactics. The real enemy was Rocky's fascism with a democratic face. So the NCLC should work with the anti-Rocky right to crush the common foe. The leadership promised that these alliances would deliver money, influence, and new recruits. After the revolution, they added, it would be easy to dispose of any right-wing allies who refused to join them. The bridge into neo-Nazi circles came through Ken Duggan, editor of The Illuminator, who introduced NCLC security staff to Willis Carto, founder of the Liberty Lobby and the most powerful American nationalist socialist of the decade. Carto's Spotlight newspaper, with nearly 200,000 readers, began running articles by LaRouche writers and selling their pamphlets. LaRouche himself visited Liberty Lobby headquarters and later met Carto in Wiesbaden. They exchanged intelligence on targets like William F. Buckley and Resorts International, and Carto quietly pushed LaRouche to focus on the Jewish bankers. In late 1977, LaRouche flew to Wiesbaden to fix the struggling German branch and met a young activist named Helga Zipp. He returned to America with her as his new bride. Almost immediately, the tone of the NCLC publications changed. New solidarity filled with savage attacks on wealthy Jewish families, Zionism, the State of Israel, and the Jewish religion itself. Crude jokes appeared alongside articles claiming that the Rothschilds had assassinated Abraham Lincoln and that the Holocaust had only killed 1.5 million Jews. Jewish members, who made up roughly a quarter of the organization, were suddenly reading that their own culture was nothing but the residue left after everything saleable had gone to the Goyim. Most Jewish LaRoucheans rationalized or simply tuned it out. Many were working 16-hour days on the street or in boiler rooms, too exhausted to read every article. Others told themselves that the attacks were aimed only at normal Jews, or Zionists, not real ones. When critics pointed out to these Jewish members that the Star of David being used as a symbol for the drug trade, members insisted it was just a graphic art symbol. LaRouche himself attempted to sell this change by writing his own history of who the real Jews were, compared to who the nefarious ones were. He declared that there were real Jews, a tiny humanist faction inspired by Philo of Alexandria, and Jews who are not Jews, as those who ran the Israel lobby and pushed Zionism. Pivoting from the more overt anti-Semitism by Willis Carto allowed for LaRouche to formulate a new basis of the oligarchy for his followers. For LaRouche, the problem became the remnants of the British Empire, the City of London, and the drug trade run by Queen Elizabeth II. So far, there have been many references to great men of history, such as Beethoven, Socrates, Leibniz, and more. LaRouche, simmering in the lives of these men since childhood, began to create a history of the world which could be broadly mapped onto a debate had between Aristotle and Plato. In classical psychology, there are a variety of mental faculties which are used to process information. You can broadly split these into sensible faculties or faculties that process sense data, such as sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. There are also other faculties called intellectual, which take the images or memories of these sensible things and try to abstract the essence or the universal concepts of said sensible things. To illustrate what I mean, the sensible faculties will take the data I can gain from my eyes, such as seeing a ball, which is a collection of colors and shapes. Then, it takes that data and creates an image. However, from a ball, I can reflect on the image and extract from the image a concept of roundness, which is a concept that describes all sorts of round objects and shapes. The process of extracting a concept from the image is called abstraction, and it occurs in the intellectual faculties of the mind. In one of Aristotle's books, De Anima, he speaks on Plato's treatment of knowledge. Plato in the Timaeus, mind is the monad. Science or knowledge, the dyad. Opinion, the number of the plane. Sensation, the number of the solid. The numbers are by him expressly identified with the forms themselves or principles, and are formed out of the elements. Now, things are apprehended either by mind or science or opinion or sensation, and these same numbers are the forms of things. So, we can think of the mind as one thing, and knowledge is the most certain thing it can grasp to. Opinion is a less certain thing the mind can grasp to, and sensation is what it grasps to, which is attached to something physical. Forms are principles, or causes of things, which are immaterial and instantiated in the world. The mind grasps forms, using the intellect to gain knowledge. This is the sort of ordering that goes from what is closest to grasping the forms, i.e., the intellectual faculties, and then what's farthest from them, which include the sensible faculties. However, Aristotle himself had a different idea. In that same work, he states, since according to common agreement, there is nothing outside and separate in existence from sensible spatial magnitudes, the objects of thought are in the sensible forms, viz., both the abstract objects and all the states and affections of sensible things. Hence, no one can learn or understand anything in the absence of sense. Here, Aristotle does not situate the forms as immaterial things grasped by the intellect, but as in material things which must be first sensed. Aristotle reverses Plato's order of knowledge by saying that one must sense what's in front of them, create an image of what said thing is, and from that, extract the form from the sensible image of a thing. LaRouche sees the fate of all history resting on this debate between Plato and Aristotle. For instance, he reads the first chapter of the book Genesis, the notion that God created man in his image, as a verification of the Platonic primary of reason, since the image of God is that ability to reason and freely will certain acts. In fact, this reference to the Bible becomes a crucial element in his political beliefs, because he deduces that from the human ability to creatively will certain things into existence, they are given dominion over nature. LaRouche moves from the image of God to explain agape, or the Greek term for love that has connotations of divine love. Over and above the creative power of humans is the necessity to create out of love. This is where LaRouche transitions from the Bible to Greek mythos. The story of Prometheus focuses on a titan, a god of old. After Zeus takes his throne on Olympus and rules the cosmos, Prometheus takes an interest in mankind. In one episode, Prometheus covers meat in ugly skin and covers fat in healthy skin. When asking Zeus for which he prefers in sacrifice, Zeus chooses the fat, and once he finds out what's under the skin covering the fat, he is enraged, although Zeus now has to accept fat offerings from the humans. Due to this anger, Zeus withholds fire to the humans. Without fire, the humans are not able to cook, forge tools, or technologically progress as a species. In a rebellion of Zeus, Prometheus, out of his divine love, out of his agape, becomes the firebringer and saves humanity, leading to his punishment in Hades, chained on a rock, with an eagle that eats his regrowing liver every day. For LaRouche, the Platonic ideal is the Promethean, the bringer of technology, and the selfless titan of divine love. However, this also presents LaRouche's eternal enemy, Zeus, the oligarchic tyrant who wishes to suppress humanity from reaching its fullest potential. One of the most pivotal events that affected Plato's life was the Peloponnesian War. Athens had become a naval empire after the Persian Wars, and Sparta feared what that growing power meant for the balance of Greece. Athens went from a land power, which focuses on projecting power through its economic and cultural resiliency in its own territory, to a sea power, which projects its military might onto other principalities abroad. In 431 BC Thebes, a Spartan ally attacked Plataea, an Athenian ally, and the war became open. In the first phase of the war, usually called the Archidamian War, Sparta's basic strategy was to invade Attica by land, while Athens, under Pericles, avoided a pitched land battle, sheltered behind the long walls, and relied on its navy to raid the Peloponnesian coast and keep its empire functioning. That strategy was badly damaged when a plague broke out in a crowded Athens and killed many civilians and soldiers, including Pericles. Even so, the war did not end quickly. Athens suppressed revolts like Mytilenes, while Sparta eventually found success under Brasidas in the north. After Brasidas and the Athenian leader Cleon were both killed at Amphipolis in 1422 BC, the two sides agreed to the Peace of Nicias in 421. The peace did not really solve anything. Instead, it became an uneasy pause, filled with maneuvering and proxy conflict. The turning point came when Athens launched the huge Sicilian expedition in 415 BC, hoping to conquer or dominate Syracuse and extend Athenian power westward. It was a disaster. Syracuse, helped by Spartan support, broke the siege. The Athenian reinforcements also failed. Then, the Athenian army and navy in Sicily were shattered in 413 BC. That catastrophe did not instantly end the war, but it crippled Athens and encouraged more revolts and renewed Spartan pressure. In the final phase, often called the Decelean or Ionian War, Athens managed a partial recovery and even won some naval successes, but it was now fighting from a weaker position. Meanwhile, Sparta gained a crucial advantage. Its commanders, especially Lysander, received substantial Persian support, which helped Sparta build and sustain a fleet strong enough to challenge Athens at sea. The decisive blow came in 405 BC at Aegospotami, where Lysander destroyed the Athenian navy. Since Athens depended on sea power to protect trade and bring in grain, that defeat was effectively fatal. The war ended in 404 BC with the surrender of Athens. Xenophon says the Spartans demanded that Athens tear down the long walls and the fortifications of Piraeus, surrender all but 12 ships, recall the exiles, and follow Sparta's leadership in foreign policy and war. So Sparta won. Athens lost its empire, and the whole Greek world was left weaker by nearly 3 decades of conflict. Plato's youth and early childhood were shaped by the collapse of Athens. Born around 429 BC, near the start of the Peloponnesian War, he came of age as the city endured invasion, plague, political upheaval, and finally defeat at the hands of Sparta in 404 BC. After the war, Sparta imposed the oligarchic rule of the 30 tyrants, among whom were two of Plato's own relatives, Critias and Charmides. Yet, the restoration of democracy did not bring real stability. Plato's teacher Socrates was eventually condemned to death on charges of corrupting the youth and impiety, largely because of his relentless questioning of the Athenian authorities. Experiences like these helped turn Plato against democracy. In Book 8 of the Republic, he presents several criticisms of it. The three most important are the following. First is the criticism that democracy treats all desires as equally valid. Plato's famous picture of the democratic man is someone who lives from impulse to impulse, one day drinking and partying, the next dieting, then exercising, then dabbling in philosophy, then rushing into politics. Because of this, there is no necessity to rule, obey, fight, keep peace, or hold office in any settled way unless one feels like it. This is best shown in the example of the Peloponnesian War, which exposed the weaknesses of the average liberal Athenian versus the disciplined Spartan. Second is the criticism that democracy makes everyone a political equal. If one is able to vote and have control over the lives of their superiors, then the boundaries between father and child, teacher and pupil, and foreigner and citizen weakens. It takes people who are experts and trained in certain domains and gives them the same rights as the ignorant. This brings us to the third criticism, that democracy empowers demagogues. A clever leader wins influence not by wisdom or restraint, but by constantly finding scapegoats, promising benefits, and keeping the crowd angry. In a state of chaos, the people elevate a protector, a champion who claims to defend them. That protector then becomes a tyrant by accusing enemies, shedding blood, asking for a bodyguard, and making himself absolute ruler. This is why Plato advocated rule by the wise. From these lessons, the need to build society as a strong land rather than a sea power, and the belief in a kind of dictatorship of the wise, LaRouche developed his own vision for America. LaRouche's anthropology of Prometheanism and his goals of creating a Platonic dictatorship allows us to understand his values and his goals. However, how did LaRouche sell his vision as applicable to the US today? For LaRouche, every civilization has its own oligarchy, its own tyranny, which had been voted in by the easily duped masses. Over time, these oligarchs would, through their connections, engage in blatant nepotism and give their children high positions in high places. LaRouche called these dynastic networks the Anglo-British Imperial Network, which had connections all the way back to Venetian banking families from the start of the Renaissance. For LaRouche, the historical heroes of America were those who promoted America as a land power. This went all the way back to the ideas of Alexander Hamilton, who advocated for the use of tariffs and subsidies in order to create a domestic manufacturing base at home. LaRouche would take different Hamiltonian policy promoters such as Henry Clay, Lincoln, Henry C. Carey, Friedrich List, and FDR all attempted to build the US up as a land power by promoting public infrastructure projects, building up manufacturing, and promoting negentropic policies, which stabilized the economy against the whims of imperialistic sea powers like the British Empire. To give an example of how LaRouche would narrativize American history, one can look into his history of the Civil War as a fight between the developmental industrialist North and the slave-holding British-influenced South. Enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic to sustain plantation production, above all, cotton, most of which was exported to Britain. There, English laborers manufactured cheap textiles, which were then sold in India, while India, in turn, was driven into opium production for export to China. Additionally, LaRouche would cite certain speeches from Abraham Lincoln as proof that the US was fighting a proxy war against the British. They would quote Abraham Lincoln speaking about how, if the British continued to support the South, they would be accessories to war, and that fighting the South was essentially a world war against the British Empire. Here, LaRouche was not inventing the material out of thin air. Slave-grown cotton really did sit near the center of the 19th century Atlantic economy. The National Park Service notes that by 1840, cotton produced in the American South earned more money than all U.S. exports combined, and the 1860 census reported total U.S. cotton exports of 4,419,215 bales, of which Great Britain alone took 3,037,762 bales. About 69% of American cotton exports that year, and enough to supply roughly 80% of Britain's cotton imports. Nor was he wrong that the larger imperial circuit extended beyond the American South. By the middle of the 19th century, India was receiving 1/4 of all British exports of cotton piece goods, after having lost many of their own export markets under British dominance. At the same time, British merchants used India's foreign trade to finance China tea imports through the export of Indian opium and cotton to China. Britannica describes this explicitly as a three-way exchange, in which tea purchased in China was paid for by India's exports of opium and cotton. But the narrative becomes false the moment those real linkages are forced into a single master explanation of the Civil War. First, the cotton boom of the antebellum South was not being sustained primarily by continuing Atlantic importation of enslaved Africans into the United States. The US banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. By the decades before the war, the expansion of cotton was being driven above all by the internal slave trade and forced migration of enslaved people from the Upper South into the Deep South. National Park Service material on Natchez notes that tens of thousands of enslaved men, women, and children were driven there from Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, and the Carolinas to sustain a cotton economy built on slave labor. That matters because LaRouche's retelling often makes the system look like a simple British pump, siphoning Africans into the South, when the mature cotton kingdoms of 1860 was also an American domestic machine of trafficking, land seizure, and coerced labor. Second, and more importantly, the Civil War was not fundamentally a proxy war orchestrated by Britain. Confederate leaders themselves were remarkably direct about the cause of secession. Mississippi declared that its position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. And the National Park Service summarizes the professional consensus plainly, stating that slavery and the status of African Americans were at the heart of the crisis that produced the war. Lincoln did see British policy as dangerous, and here again there is a kernel of truth that LaRouche inflates into a myth. In July 1861, Lincoln warned Congress that the Confederates were already invoking recognition, aid, and intervention from foreign powers. Britain did grant the Confederacy belligerent status in May 1861. The Trent Affair brought the United States and Britain into a severe diplomatic crisis, and British shipyards produced commerce raiders such as the Alabama. After the war, the dispute over those British-built Confederate cruisers ended with Britain paying the United States $15.5 million in the Alabama claim settlement. Lincoln also complained that in 1862, the maritime powers had unwisely and unnecessarily recognized the insurgents as belligerents. All of that is real, but it still does not make the Civil War essentially a war against Britain, any more than the war in Ukraine a war between the US funding Ukraine and North Korea, who shipped off soldiers to fight in said war. As we said before, LaRouche valued the hierarchy of reasoning and its sovereignty over the world. The world was made for man, not man for the world. In doing so, LaRouche had a deep hatred for those who desecrated the creativity innate in all human beings. In doing so, he lambasted the pseudoscience of progressive eugenics. He would call out the paganism of tree-hugging hippies and environmentalists. Lastly, for LaRouche, warmongers were all conspiring to depopulate massive swaths of the human race in lesser developed continents all around the world, so that empires who considered themselves hard sea powers would have an easier time subjugating places abroad. Returning back to the Anglo-British imperial network, the British origins of these ideas sprouted up in private clubs in the late 19th century. First, the X Club was a dining club of 9 men who supported the theories of natural selection and academic liberalism. LaRouche would tie these thinkers to the progenitors of the eugenics movement in the US. Additionally, the Imperial Federation movement around George Parkin and Alfred Milner was seen as one of those first pushes towards a British-controlled federal empire, which would be a staging ground of one world government. Finally, British imperialist and magnate Cecil Rhodes was seen as the central contact when it came to elite recruitment, eventually expressed through the Rhodes Trust and the broader Round Table network. One of the distributors of these ideas, which were brought to the West, was the Tavistock Institute, a British non-profit research and consulting organization which played a key role in the development of psychology in the UK during World War II. If you want a rundown of what the conspiracy is and how accurate it is in explaining the rise of certain political trends, I recommend Timba on Toast's A Critique of the Tavistock Institute, the mother of all conspiracy theories, which we will link in the description below. This led to LaRouche's greatest conspiracy theory around the importation of British drugs into the US, which were produced in Maoist China. The main claims of this conspiracy were laid out in a book called Dope Inc., which was authored by Konstantinos Kalimkis, David Goldman, and Jeffrey Steinberg, who were important high-ranking members of the NCLC. The Golden Triangle is the border intersection of Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar, Burma, at the confluence of the Ruak and Mekong rivers. In the 1970s, there was publicly released data on the amount of heroin produced in the area and exported, and according to DEA figures, there was around 700 tons exported, while the authors claimed that 3 tons could supply the US's entire market annually. The authors then argue that Hong Kong is the financial choke point of the global drug trade, that HSBC/Hongsheng sits above a regional network of overseas Chinese banks and middlemen, and that money from US street sales is laundered back through offshore finance, precious metals, and Far Eastern wholesalers. They then cite certain connections between those in Hong Kong and China running production in the Golden Triangle, specifically the Chatham House, the Order of St. John, and a web of aristocratic and banking lineages in being the main organizers of this trade from the UK. There were indeed hard facts on which such a story could feed. The Golden Triangle really was a major opium zone, and US intelligence estimates from the period put Burma, Thailand, and Laos at roughly 700 to 750 tons of opium annually. Another contemporaneous US assessment stated that about 700 tons of opium could yield roughly 70 tons of heroin, which was many times the estimated 10 to 12 tons required to sustain the US heroin population in that period. And an October 1969 Nixon administration memorandum estimated total US annual heroin consumption at 3 tons, with about 80% then coming from France, 15% from Mexico, and only 5% from Bangkok and Hong Kong, linked to Burma, Laos, Thailand, and Yunnan. So, the raw numbers were alarming, but they did not prove that the American heroin market was centrally run from Hong Kong, still less that it was a British-directed war machine. The Maoist China part is where the narrative starts to wobble even worse. Some US officials in 1969 still mentioned Yunnan as one source area for opiates reaching Hong Kong and Bangkok. But the larger historical literature points in the opposite direction as the main trend. Scholarship on post-1950 opium history emphasizes Maoist suppression of opium production in the early 1950s, and later public health scholarship describes China under Mao as relatively drug-free until the late 1970s, when trafficking re-emerged among the borders adjacent to the Golden Triangle. Additionally, the book uses sources on China from Harry Anslinger, a journalist and former commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and John Henry Keswick, an influential Scottish businessman in China and Hong Kong. Harry Anslinger and others did publicly accuse Communist China of large-scale narcotics trafficking, and contemporary press did echo these accusations. But later scholarship based on declassified records says Anslinger manipulated intelligence, exaggerated Cold War stereotypes, and that what is widely accepted today is that the communist government attempted to suppress cultivation and trafficking. Another scholarly study of China's 1950s anti-drug campaigns likewise describes them as a major state-building effort and emphasizes the CCP's public anti-drug stance before and after 1949. The same pattern appears with John Henry Keswick. It is true that Keswick was a senior Jardine Matheson figure, had wartime intelligence and service links, and developed a personal relationship with Zhou Enlai, the former premier of the People's Republic of China. It is also true that a 1949 US consular report recorded that after Keswick had spoken with Shanghai's communist mayor, he told the American consul general that he did not expect Americans fare well under communist regime. These pieces of evidence do not prove a British-Chinese narcotics alliance. At most, it shows that Keswick was talking directly to communist officials and that US diplomats suspected that he had discussed more than he had admitted. Hong Kong, meanwhile, was important enough without embellishment. The Justice Department and academic summaries describe it as a major port and transit point with a long history in regional drug trade, and a 1990 scholarly article on Hong Kong's banking industry called it one of the world's leading centers for laundering drug money, stressing its bank secrecy, traditions, large financial sector, and lack of exchange controls. Another Hong Kong drug market study noted that trafficking generated some of the most lucrative illicit proceeds in the territory, and that Hong Kong was susceptible to money laundering because of its sophisticated banking facilities and low-tax, open financial system. Those are serious claims, and they help explain why LaRouche's inner circle could make Hong Kong feel like a financial nerve center. But they still describe a permissive, commercial and transit environment, not proof that HSBC, Chatham House, or a knightly order sat atop a single command pyramid. In the early 1970s, terrorism, the Vietnam War, the collapse of Bretton Woods, rising inflation, and then the 1973 oil shock all led to LaRouche and his followers predicting an insurrection coming around the corner. Select NCLC members were shipped to a secret boot camp near Argyle, New York, where they trained in riflery, explosives, and small arms tactics. They practiced taking hills and played capture the flag like a revolutionary army. Back home, local NCLC militias drilled with poles, marching in circles, and preparing for class warfare. Atop aide even wrote a study of Tito's World War II partisans as the model for LaRouche's future fighting force. As the group attempted to build a left-right coalition, LaRouche's followers began quietly courting the US military. NCLC staffers phoned high-ranking officers, including the commander of the 18th Airborne Corps at Fort Bragg, warning that a Carter presidency would destroy the Republic. They sent memos to the Army Chief of Staff urging the military to crush Wall Street and reorganize the economy. Security staff targeted officers such as Major General John Singlaub. John K. Jack Singlaub was a U.S. Army officer and OSS commando whose career began in World War II. Born in 1921, he left UCLA for the Army in 1943, parachuted into southern France with a Jedburgh team to aid the resistance, and later served in China, where OSS teams were involved in prisoner recovery and intelligence work at the close of the war. After 1945, he remained tied to the Asian Cold War theater, and then served in Korea with the CIA's Jack mission, where Arsov history says he was the operations chief and de facto deputy commander / chief of staff, responsible for recruiting experienced military personnel into covert work behind communist lines. Those assignments made him, in substance, a hard-line Cold War operator years before he became publicly famous for later anti-communist activism. By the 1960s and early 1970s, Singlaub had become one of the Army's best-known unconventional warfare commanders. He led MACV-SOG in Vietnam from 1966 to 1968, placing him at the center of some of the most secret U.S. cross-border and special operations activity of the war. And by the early 1970s, he was already a senior general officer in Washington. In May 1979, the National Office was briefed that a military coup, backed by anti-communist allies, would install LaRouche as dictator before the 1980 election. In a campaign speech, he openly called for abolishing democracy and hinted at a march on Washington. This was LaRouche's grand plan, creating a Platonist Hamiltonian dictatorship to fight against the British menace. However, prior to this, in 1975, Lyndon LaRouche began pushing for space-based particle beams and laser weapons, years before most of Washington had ever heard of the idea. The Fusion Energy Foundation, or the FEF, set up as a respectable scientific front for the NCLC, became the main propaganda machine. It published the glossy magazine Fusion, hosted conferences, and cultivated top physicists and engineers while quietly steering the conversation toward beam weapons. LaRouche privately argued that an all-out American-Soviet nuclear war was an existential threat, and that first strike capabilities had to be developed. Between 120 and 180 million Americans would die in the first exchange alone. His solution was a multi-trillion-dollar crash program to build a space-based particle beam missile shield. The FEF pushed it hard, with airport posters screaming, "Beam the bomb." On the surface, it looked purely defensive. In reality, it was something far darker. The FEF won real credibility by aggressively campaigning for more government money for fusion research at a time when the nuclear industry was under siege. Scientists at the Department of Energy's Office of Fusion Energy spoke at FEF events and praised its work, even while admitting they disliked the politics. One senior DOE official told the group that they were, quote, "one of the few organized groups I know of that has the courage to stand up and advocate high technology." The LaRoucheans responded with airport tables, speaking tours, and relentless lobbying that helped turn fusion into a national issue. They even drafted language for a 1980 congressional bill that set fusion development as a major national goal. While promoting fusion, the FEF also waged war on the anti-nuclear movement. After 3 Mile Island, they screamed, "Sabotage," sold more nukes, less kooks bumper stickers, and suggested the United States should follow the Soviet Union's hard line against environmentalists. They attacked Jane Fonda, called anti-nuclear scientists traitors, and positioned themselves as the tough, pro-technology voice the nuclear industry desperately needed. Power company executives and aerospace managers began waving Fusion magazine around their offices, impressed by its technical quality and unapologetic boosterism. In the spring of 1981, New Solidarity already reported that President Ronald Reagan favored a space-based anti-missile system. The Fusion Energy Foundation immediately held a Washington seminar on anti-missile beam potentials, but the real campaign exploded the following winter when LaRouche received a message from a mysterious figure known only as Mr. Ed, supposedly speaking for a faction inside of the CIA. LaRouche later told his lawyers he accepted the assignment. In February 1982, he held a forum in Washington calling for a major beam weapons drive as the perfect counter to the nuclear freeze movement. Behind the scenes, they had built extraordinary access. They cultivated Edward Teller for years, shifting from calling him a Rockefeller agent to hailing him as an ally. Edward Teller was a Hungarian-born American physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project. Teller promoted a nuclear-pumped X-ray laser for missile defense. A nuclear explosion would quote-unquote pump lasing rods and generate intense X-ray beams aimed at incoming missiles. The LaRoucheites published Teller's speeches, dubbed the idea the LaRouche-Teller Initiative, and sent Dr. Stephen Bardwell, the director of the FEF, on a campus tour to recruit students for the Higher Peace movement. Over the next year, the LaRouchians flooded Capitol Hill with proposals, white papers, and briefings promoting Edward Teller's X-ray laser scheme. When Ronald Reagan gave his historic Star Wars speech on the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, on March 23, 1983, announcing the Strategic Defense Initiative, the LaRouchians were not surprised at all.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? I know this is a formidable technical task, one that may not be accomplished before the end of this century. I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
They had been in contact for years with the very officials and scientists who helped shape the proposal. Many of the fusion researchers the FEF had courted in the late 1970s simply shifted into SDI work. LaRouche's people saw the program as the perfect vehicle for their long-term agenda: total national mobilization, beam weapon supremacy, and the first step toward the kind of high-tech dictatorship they had been planning all along. The media churned to the FEF for explanations, all quoted LaRouchean spokesmen. National Safety Council official Dr. Ray Pollock met multiple times with top LaRouche aides and even sat down with LaRouche himself to discuss SDI economics. Department of Energy fusion scientists spoke at FEF events and praised their work. Livermore and Pentagon researchers took their calls and sometimes appeared at their conferences. The State Department even sent a cable instructing U.S. embassies to stop bad-mouthing LaRouche. The LaRouchians wasted no time claiming credit. They told anyone who would listen that LaRouche was the real intellectual author of SDI. Their October 1983 Senate seminar on beam weapons was packed with government officials and foreign diplomats. The FEF's book, Beam Defense, won an award from the Aviation Space Writers Association and was described by experts as one of the most detailed public studies available on particle beams and X-ray lasers. John Pike of the Federation of American Scientists admitted he first learned about Teller's secret Excalibur project from the LaRouchians. The LaRouchians took the campaign global, holding conferences in Paris, Bonn, Rome, and Tokyo. to sell SDI to NATO allies and turn Japan into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. They helped launch pro-Star Wars parties like Patriots for Germany and France et son armée. Retired generals and colonels toured with them. Pentagon officials spoke at LaRouchean rallies. Even as federal prosecutors later raided the Fusion Energy Foundation on fraud charges, many SDI scientists and engineers continued to defend the group. Dr. Stephen Bardwell, the key science advisor to Lyndon LaRouche, quit the organization in early 1984 and sent a blunt letter to his former comrades. He revealed what many insiders already knew but refused to admit. LaRouche's beam weapons push was never about defense. It was designed as a first strike system based on denying the Soviet Union any right to exist in its present form. Privately, the LaRoucheans had even discussed true doomsday weapons, including cobalt bombs with fans. LaRouche used the SDI campaign to weld together scattered European and American neo-fascist forces. He reached out to former Nazi scientists from Peenemünde, who had built V-2 rockets and jet aircraft. He courted retired West German officers such as Admiral Karl Adolf Zinker, who had once praised convicted Nazi war criminals, and the Brigadier General Paul Albert Scherer, former chief of West German military counterintelligence. They joined his Patriots for Germany group and defended him publicly. The campaign became a rallying point for old Nazis and new dreams. The LaRoucheans went all out to protect Operation Paperclip veterans accused of war crimes. They defended Arthur Rudolph, the engineer who ran the Mittelwerk factory where thousands of slave laborers from Dora Nordhausen died. They portrayed him as a patriotic victim of a communist plot and held emotional reunions and conferences glorifying the classic German tradition of Peenemünde. Their publications featured a glowing four-pronged plasmoid that looked strikingly like a swastika, later explained as a model of cosmic spirals representing higher stages of consciousness, race, and weapons technology. The symbolism was unmistakable to SS veterans. By 1987, LaRouche dropped all pretense in a speech at a Munich seminar packed with military officers and Bavarian defense contractors. He declared that the next revolution in military technology would be electromagnetic, mass-killing weapons using the full range of the spectrum. These weapons, he said, could fry the entire Soviet population while leaving factories and railroads intact. Whoever developed them first would dominate the planet. This was the true endgame of his grand design. Not a shield, but a sword. In the mid-1970s, the LaRoucheans began building a nationwide election machine. At first, it grew slowly, but everything changed when they started running in Democratic primaries. They pulled in thousands of ordinary Americans, especially angry senior citizens, struggling farmers, small businessmen, blue-collar workers, and inner-city blacks. By 1984, they had become the most successful extremist election operation in modern American history. The numbers were staggering. Between 1982 and 1988, they contested almost 4,000 Democratic primaries and general elections in more than 30 states. Their candidates won over 4 million votes. In at least 70 statewide congressional or legislative races, they captured more than 20%. 25 LaRouche followers actually became Democratic nominees, either by beating regular Democrats or running unopposed. Hundreds more won local party posts, mostly county committee seats. No other fringe group in America came close to this level of ballot access and vote totals. They started as the U.S. Labor Party in 1971, a pure NCLC vehicle that sounded bizarre to most voters, with its warning of imminent nuclear war and famine. But they learned fast. They mastered petition drives, fought ballot challenges, and used shoestring tactics like radio talk shows, neighborhood papers, and noisy protests. In Boston, they exploited white backlash against busing. In Baltimore, their candidate ran openly racist and anti-Semitic attacks on a black congressman and still pulled 11% of the vote. In 1979, LaRouche switched to the Democrats and ran for president in the 1980 New Hampshire primary, calling himself a native son and a candidate more American than apple pie. He spent over $1 million and promised 2,500 new nuclear plants. But the cultish intensity showed. His bodyguards carried guns, and they aggressively harvested absentee ballots from seniors. On election day, he only got 2%. He screamed fraud and demanded a recount that added just 19 votes. Still, the campaign proved his machine worked. He qualified for primaries in 15 states, receiving 185,000 votes, 4 times his 1976 total, and collected over $500,000 in federal matching funds. Millions saw his network TV ads portraying him as a Franklin Roosevelt Democrat fighting the Eastern establishment. The party leadership mostly shrugged him off as a joke. LaRouche didn't care. He had made a name for himself. Shortly after the 1980 Democratic Convention, Lyndon LaRouche told his followers the NCLC was in the two-party system to stay. He disbanded the U.S. Labor Party and launched the National Democratic Policy Committee, a name deliberately chosen to sound like an official arm of the Democratic leadership. The NDPC kicked off with a fiery rally in Huntsville, Alabama, calling for Paul Volcker to be hanged, but internal bloodletting soon took priority. LaRouche purged his own chief of staff, Gus Kalimgas, over the New Hampshire flop, and then gutted the entire Detroit regional leadership. Dozens of top cadres walked out in disgust. In 1981, the NDPC ran only one major candidate, Melvin Klanetsky, for mayor of New York. In a stunning display of cynicism, Mayor Ed Koch's re-election team worked quietly, welcoming Klanetsky into debates and forums. They used the LaRouchean as a buffer against their real challenger, Assemblyman Frank Barbaro, hoping to split the anti-Koch vote and keep the race from becoming a clear two-man contest. Koch refused to denounce Klanetsky's well-documented anti-Semitism and even insisted that he stay on the stage. Klanetsky ended up with 25,000 votes, 5% of the primary turnout. A similar situation occurred in 1982. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan was the only major Democrat who fought back, spending $1.3 million and challenging every one of Klanetsky's 30,000 petition signatures in his Senate re-election race. Klanetsky still pulled 162,000 votes statewide. Elsewhere, the NDPC scored even more impressively, 19% in the Pennsylvania gubernatorial primary, 32% in a Minnesota congressional race, and 19% for Deborah Freeman in her second run against Barbara Mikulski in Baltimore. Mainstream Democrats and the media mostly shrugged it off as a fringe sideshow. By 1983, LaRouche launched a full-scale candidates movement, recruiting hundreds of ordinary ultra-conservative Americans, farmers, small businessmen, and senior citizens to run as LaRouche Democrats. They were given crash training and sent into primaries with simple populist slogans about beam weapons, farm aid, and fighting the Eastern establishment. In 1984, the NDPC fielded over 2,000 candidates in more than 30 states. LaRouche himself ran for president again, collecting over $500,000 in federal matching funds and appeared in 14 half-hour network TV ads. His slate of grassroots candidates racked up nearly 2 million votes and elected 280 people to local Democratic county committees. The party leadership continued to do almost nothing. Most Democratic officials treated the NDPC like an annoying joke rather than a growing force inside their own ranks.
By 1985, the NDPC had 500 candidates running nationwide and was steadily building strength in farm states and blue-collar districts. The stage was set. The long, cynical tolerance of the Democratic establishment had allowed LaRouche's election machine to grow from a handful of cultists into a serious political force. The breakthrough everyone had ignored was coming, and it would hit in the heartland of blue-collar America, Illinois, in 1986. On March 18, 1986, the Illinois Democratic Party received the greatest shock in its history. Followers of Lyndon LaRouche won the nominations for Lieutenant Governor and Secretary of State. Mark Fairchild, 28, and Janice Hart, 31, captured the top 2 seats on the ticket in a low turnout primary. The LaRouchians themselves were stunned. Their Chicago team had skipped watching the returns to stage a mock exorcism outside the house of a University of Chicago professor they called an evil warlock. The next day, Hart announced her plans for a different kind of purge. "I'm going to revive the spirit of Abraham Lincoln and General Patton," she declared. "We're going to roll our tanks down State Street." Democratic candidate for governor Adlai Stevenson III was horrified. He called Hart and Fairchild neo-Nazis and refused to run on the same ticket. There is no room in the Democratic Party for candidates who preach anti-Semitism, who cavort with the Ku Klux Klan, and who want to destroy labor unions. Stevenson quit the Democratic line and formed the Illinois Solidarity Party. The media exploded. Janice Hart appeared on Nightline. LaRouche nearly made it to the Newsweek cover, and columnists called it the face of American fascism. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan blamed the party's failed political immune system. LaRouche himself told the National Press Club it was a forgotten majority rising up. The new George Wallace voters ready to stick it up to Washington. Democrats insisted it was a fluke. Low turnout, confusing names, and lazy campaigning by regular candidates had let 2 unknowns slip through. But the numbers told a different story. Hart and Fairchild were part of a 30-candidate Warrior Angel slate. Other NDPC candidates pulled 15 to 42% in congressional races across the state. In one district, the NDPC nominee took 42.5%. These results matched a steady upward trend in Midwest primaries since 1982. Pollster Michael McKeon had warned state leaders a year earlier that blue-collar and farm voters were ripe for LaRouche's message. The party ignored him. For over a decade, the LaRouchians had laid the groundwork. They ran farm rallies, protested auctions, built ties with Teamsters and labor unions, and staged anti-drug drives in black churches and mosques. They blanketed O'Hare with literature tables 7 days a week and ran hundreds of candidates for low-level offices to learn the system. In 1984, they won dozens of suburban county committee seats. By 1986, they knew exactly where the anger was strongest. Their simple, populist pitch about cracking down on drug pushers, saving farms, and building beam weapons resounded with thousands who knew exactly what they were voting for. In November, the mask came off. Hart still pulled 478,000 votes, over 15%, even after 7 months of non-stop negative coverage. She ran almost as strongly as the Solidarity Party candidate backed by Stevenson and the regular Democrats. The chaos helped Republicans sweep the state. James Thompson won re-election by 400,000 votes. LaRouche had turned the Illinois Democratic primary into a national embarrassment and handed the heartland of blue-collar America to the GOP for 4 more years. The party had done nothing to stop him, and now paid the price. Despite the nationwide media firestorm that followed the 1986 Illinois primary shock, the NDPC machine kept rolling. LaRouche candidates ran in 31 states that year, fielding 157 for Congress, 14 for U.S. Senate, dozens for state legislatures and hundreds more for Democratic Party posts. They pulled in well over 1 million votes in the post-Illinois primaries and general elections. Almost half of their tracked primary candidates received more than 10% of the vote, with dozens scoring between 20 and 40%, and several breaking the 40% mark in every region of the country. In Oklahoma, farmer George Gentry took 33% in a two-way U.S. Senate race. In Indiana, Georgia Irie captured 26% against a regular Democrat who aggressively attacked her LaRouche ties. In Iowa, former Union leader Juan Cortez pulled 16% for Senate, with multiple counties giving him over 20%. NDPC candidates hit 20 to 40% in over 20 congressional races from California to Pennsylvania. They also won 2 contested Michigan State Senate primaries and picked up multiple uncontested nominations in Ohio, Texas, and Indiana. The LaRoucheans continued their quiet but effective infiltration of the Democratic Party apparatus itself. They claimed around 50 victories for Democratic county committee seats and other internal posts. Most dramatically, in Harris County, Texas, the second largest election district in America, staunch LaRouche loyalist Claude Jones defeated the incumbent Democratic county chairman by a narrow margin. The victory came after years of patient organizing and exploiting low turnout races where regular Democrats often failed to campaign seriously. By 1988, momentum was still building. LaRouche ran for president in more states than ever, including Super Tuesday, while his followers recruited over 200 delegate candidates in California alone. In Pennsylvania, Stephen Douglas took 13% in the Senate primary. In Illinois, Sheila Jones pulled 21% for Cook County Recorder of Deeds. The NDPC kept winning significant percentages in farm-heavy and blue-collar districts nationwide, even after years of intense negative coverage. Democratic leaders across the country continued to downplay the threat, calling each strong showing a fluke caused by low turnout or confusing names. But the pattern was clear, and it was growing. The tanks were not just rolling down State Street in rhetoric anymore. They were beginning to roll through American politics. During his 8 years of presidential press conferences, Ronald Reagan often took questions from Executive Intelligence Review correspondents. The EIR, or Executive Intelligence Review, is a weekly political and intelligence-style magazine founded in 1974 by Lyndon LaRouche. It functioned as one of the main publications for the LaRouche movement, presenting itself not merely as a news magazine, but as a kind of geopolitical intelligence service. Its origin lies in LaRouche's attempt in the 1970s to build a worldwide information and influence network. According to accounts of its history, LaRouche's circle first created the New Solidarity International Press Service in 1974, and EIR emerged from that project as a more formal weekly publication aimed at officials, businesses, activists, and readers interested in international affairs. On August 3, 1988, the question and answer created a furor. EIR's Nick Benton asked the president if he thought Michael Dukakis should make his medical records public. Benton was alluding to rumors spread by his own NCLC colleagues that the Democratic presidential nominee had sought psychiatric help for depression in the late 1970s. Reagan, grinning, answered,
"Look, I'm not going to pick on an invalid."
The remark elicited groans of dismay from the assembled reporters, and Reagan half apologized several hours later. Yet the president had managed to transform an unsubstantiated smear into a major international news story. The LaRoucheans had started their Dukakis rumors at the convention, with leaflets asking, "Is Dukakis the new Senator Eagleton?" The depressed VP candidate under George McGovern, who hid his depression, who was deemed unfit for office when it was found out. Afterward, they called daily newspapers around the country, telling each that its competitors were already hot on the story. Fearful of being scooped, editors and reporters reacted predictably. Dukakis headquarters received a barrage of inquiries. Although campaign spokesmen denied everything and the LaRoucheans offered no solid evidence, the rumors became newsworthy simply as rumors. The weekend before Reagan's invalid quip, a half-dozen important dailies reported the story. The LaRoucheans had conducted scores of dirty trick operations against the Democrats, and occasionally against moderate Republicans on behalf of the Reaganites, over the previous 12 years. Almost totally ignored by the press except in the earliest and least harmful stage. This campaign is probably the largest and certainly the longest running operation of its type in American electoral history. The NCLC's wooing of the Republicans began in 1976, when LaRouche was running for president on the U.S. Labor Party ticket. Shortly after Jimmy Carter won the Democratic nomination, LaRouche shifted from seeking votes for himself to diverting votes to President Ford. NCLC defectors recall meetings that summer and fall to plan pro-Ford and anti-Carter activities. The LaRoucheans collected $96,000 on an emergency basis to pay for LaRouche's half-hour speech on NBC TV, warning the nation about Carter's alleged mental imbalance. Federal Election Commission records show large donations to LaRouche's campaign committee the day before the election. The reputed donors were NCLC members, covering for the real donors. After the election, the Republicans joined with the LaRouche organization in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and Wisconsin to challenge the election returns in court on grounds of vote fraud. The objective was to deprive Carter of his edge in electoral college votes. The LaRoucheans' biggest effort ever was against the Democrats' 1984 national ticket. What they were planning was suggested by their attitude towards the party's May 1983 telethon. They called it a disgustathon, and a cover for the laundering of drug money. The heart of the 1984 LaRouche operation was the NDPC candidates movement, a spectacular eruption of approximately 2,000 candidates into Democratic primaries. This was not part of the normal electoral process within the party, but a deliberate disruption orchestrated from without. Most of the candidates had no commitment to the party. Some were LaRouche cadre. Others were senior citizens only dimly conscious of what they were doing. Many were longtime ultra-conservatives, well aware that the point was to help Reagan. The rhetoric of their campaigns was anti-Mandale, rarely criticizing the Republicans. They staunchly supported Reagan's key policies such as Star Wars. In effect, they were an extension of the Republican presidential campaign into the ranks of the Democratic Party. In an October 1987 review of Bob Woodward's Iran-Contra book, LaRouche held forth on the subject of propaganda.
There is no morality, no truth.
In a propaganda war, he wrote,
A choice is made to boost or to discredit this or that personality, group, issue, or policy. And the mechanics of the PSYOPs trade go to work without scruple to get the job done.
The statement referred to the CIA and the KGB, but LaRouche might as well have been talking about the NCLC. Few organizations have ranged the ideological map with such adroit inconsistency. First, they attacked the US government for being soft on communism. Then they criticized it for giving aid to the Nicaraguan Contras. They praised the NAACP for its support of nuclear power, and then they met with the Ku Klux Klan leaders and bemoaned the decline of the white race. When they enjoyed access to the Reagan administration, LaRouche said that Reagan was touched by greatness. After the administration cut them off, LaRouche called Reagan a man of low intelligence, pussy-whipped by the First Lady. One of LaRouche's most ludicrous campaigns was his attempt to turn the AIDS crisis into a referendum on deporting gay men. at a moment when the disease was still terrifying, poorly understood by most of the public, and heavily associated in the popular imagination with gay men and drug users, LaRouche saw an opening. Through his followers, he argued that AIDS needed to be restored to California's list of communicable diseases, a move critics warned could open the door to quarantine. The vehicle for this campaign was the Prevent AIDS Now Initiative Committee, better known by the grotesquely fitting acronym PANIC. LaRouche's activists placed Proposition 64 on the California ballot in 1986, with Khusro Gandhi, Brian Lance, and other LaRouche figures tied to the effort. Its supporters insisted it was merely a sane public health measure, but its campaign literature leaned into claims that AIDS might spread through insects, casual contact, or respiratory means. Claims California officials and medical experts challenged as scientifically unsupported. The results were disturbing, even in defeat. Proposition 64 lost in November 1986 by roughly 71% to 29%, but that still meant more than 2 million Californians voted for it. LaRouche's people came back again in 1988 with Proposition 69, described at the time as virtually identical to the 1986 measure, but once again tried to ride the public's fear of AIDS into state power. The 1988 version also failed, but the fact that the campaign could return at all showed how useful PANIC had become as a political instrument. Lyndon LaRouche may not have set out in the beginning to build something that resembled a criminal enterprise, but step by step, that is what he built. LaRouche's first great tutor in the underworld was a Georgia-based soldier of fortune named Mitch Verbel. Verbel was sold to the rank-and-file followers as a veteran government anti-drug fighter, but that was a half-truth at best. His real career as a CIA contract employee had brought him into intimate contact with criminals from the Caribbean to Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle. In the early 1970s, he had become notorious as the manufacturer of the Ingram Mac-10, the compact submachine gun that became the favored weapon of cocaine traffickers throughout the Western Hemisphere. In 1975, a federal grand jury in Miami indicted Verbel as the kingpin of a conspiracy to smuggle 50,000 pounds of Colombian marijuana a month into Florida. His co-defendants formed a cross-section of Midwestern organized crime: John Nardi, a Cleveland Teamster official; Morton Franklin, a Cleveland insurance man with deep ties to the mob; and 2 Southern arms dealers. The case had begun when a major Florida cocaine smuggler named Kenneth Bernstein flipped and agreed to run sting operations for the government. 27 federal agents, fitted out with planes and yachts, had spent 7 months gathering 55 hours of audio tapes and videotapes. And then, only weeks before the 1976 trial, Bernstein's private plane crashed during a Mojave Desert air show. The FBI suspected that Nardi had ordered the killing, but it could prove nothing. Without their star witness, prosecutors had dropped more than 60 other smuggling cases, and most of the Verbel tapes were ruled inadmissible. The defense argued, with magnificent audacity, that the men had only been pretending to smuggle dope as part of a government anti-drug operation, so secret that it had no name. Former Nixon aide Eagle Crow, called as a defense witness, testified that he had never heard of any such super-secret outfit. After 10 hours of deliberation, the jury acquitted them all. As the prosecutor told the jurors at the close of the case, there was not one scintilla of evidence that any of these men had ever worked for the US government. The violence around the case was extraordinary. One midnight in July 1975, as the sting was still in progress, Verbel's arms business partner, retired Army Colonel Robert Bayard, was found shot dead with a single bullet to the head in an Atlanta shopping center. The murder was never solved. In May 1977, John Nardi was killed by a dynamite blast in the parking lot of Cleveland Teamsters Joint Council. That same month, a co-defendant nicknamed Boom Boom Greco was gunned down in his car. Years later, Morton Franklin was caught buying a kilo of cocaine from an undercover FBI agent and forfeited bail because he had allegedly tried to hire a hitman to kill the agent. If LaRouche planned to associate with such circles, it was no wonder he soon felt he needed round-the-clock bodyguards. The LaRouchean inner circle knew exactly who Verbel was. A 1977 security staff dossier outlined his ties to the fugitive financier and cocaine trafficker Robert Vesco, and speculated about possible links to Florida drug kingpin Santos Traficante Jr. None of this stopped them. Verbel became a fount of tall tales, technical briefings on smuggling and money laundering, and above all, introductions. It was natural, in a strange way, that LaRouche's entrance into organized crime should run through the Teamsters Union. He had once been a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, which had helped build the Union into a powerful force in the 1930s. Now, decades later, he wanted what he called a grand coalition of America's industrial producers to smash the power of the bankers. Who better to qualify as industrial producers, he reasoned, than America's truck drivers? But the Teamster leaders he set out to recruit were not honest working men. They were people like Jackie Presser, the bloated boss of the Cleveland Joint Council, and the Presser's longtime associate, John Nardi, the same Nardi who had been Verbel's co-defendant in the marijuana trial. In 1977 and 1978, the Teamster leadership was reeling, and trucking deregulation loomed as a threat to the union's bargaining power. The LaRoucheans arrived bearing a simple message. It was all one big establishment plot, and the union should counterattack. Presser liked the sound of that. The LaRouche newspaper, News Solidarity, urged Teamsters to rally behind him. NCLC members appeared at highway off-ramps to sell that paper and pass out flyers attacking reform groups. Soon, Presser was lifting LaRouchean rhetoric directly into his own union editorials, complaining about cleverly orchestrated campaigns by social reformers, socialists, and powerful money interests in alliance with the CIA. By the fall of 1977, even Teamsters president Frank Fitzsimmons was weaving LaRouche's Rockefeller conspiracy theories into his speeches. He briefly considered hiring the LaRoucheans outright as his own propaganda hit squad, until his own staff attorneys, alarmed, dragged in a journalist who specialized in exposing the group and laid out the full picture. Fitzsimmons backed away, and in January 1978, the Teamsters General Executive Board passed a resolution disclaiming any association with the LaRoucheans. But it was theater. Presser kept working with them, and by the summer, he had infiltrated a national conference of the rank-and-file reform group OD, and produced a 32-page intelligence report for Fitzsimmons. One by one, executive board members forgot all about the resolution. Throughout 1978 and 1979, the LaRoucheans functioned as a kind of on-call truth squad for mob-linked Teamster officials facing reform challenges in their locals. Their best-selling pamphlet, The Plot to Destroy the Teamsters, blamed Wall Street bankers and liberal foundations for the entire reform movement. By late 1977, New Solidarity was claiming 46,000 copies in print, with bulk purchases by 20 Teamster locals. On Long Island, NCLC operatives even helped John Cody, a 4-time convicted felon and friend of the late mafia boss Carlo Gambino, fend off a challenge in Local 282. After the insurgents were defeated and an election marred by intimidation, New Solidarity quoted Cody's thanks.
"You gave us ammunition to win."
By 1979, the LaRoucheans had cast their net even wider in the Teamster universe. The catch they were proudest of was a Detroit man named Roland McMaster. The NCLC praised McMaster as one of the most respected voices in organized labor. In reality, he was one of Detroit's most notorious hoodlums, who had taken the Fifth Amendment more than 52 times before the McClellan Committee in 1959, and later served federal prison time for 32 counts of labor extortion. He was, by some accounts, Jimmy Hoffa's top leg breaker and a personal liaison between Hoffa and Meyer Lansky, Santos Trafficante, and the Genovese mob of the Northeast. In May of 1979, McMaster met privately with LaRouche, then went on to endorse him as the anti-drug candidate for president. The NCLC reproduced the endorsement in hundreds of thousands of leaflets across the Midwest and launched a so-called Teamster Committee to elect LaRouche president, whose actual officers were Detroit NCLC members rather than Teamsters. The Detroit Joint Council of the Union, led by enemies of McMaster, promptly condemned the whole stunt. Fitzsimmons, blindsided, was forced to send the LaRouche campaign a public letter calling its leaflets false and misleading. LaRouche replied with a long, unctuous open letter that managed to imply both that he understood the immense pressures on Fitzsimmons and that the Teamsters and the NCLC were really in the same boat as victims of liberal persecution. They even sketched out his vision. In a LaRouche administration, the Teamsters would be the backbone of a new American system, with thousands of executive jobs reserved for union men. In the fall of 1979, LaRouche jettisoned his old U.S. Labor Party label and entered the Democratic primaries. The center of the operation was New Hampshire, and the consultant in charge of the New Hampshire campaign was a Detroit man named John R. Ferris, McMaster's closest friend and reputed business partner. Ferris later said that the campaign offered him a fee so high he couldn't say no. One of the experts he sent in was a former Michigan state senator who had been sentenced to 6 months in federal prison for his role in a $3 million Florida land swindle, and who, while appealing his conviction, ran the LaRouche volunteer operation. Even more colorful was a Manchester businessman named George Catter. Catter was regarded by the FBI as a leader of organized crime in New Hampshire. According to a former top LaRouche aide, the NCLC leadership paid Catter $100,000 to try and fix the early reporting election in Dixville Notch. LaRouche later called the scheme the Have a $100 Bill plan, and blamed an aide for its failure. The cash, it appeared, had come from a loan with Bank Bumiputra, Malaysia, that the LaRoucheans later defaulted on. Qatar himself eventually acknowledged that the LaRoucheans had asked him for help in the primary, said 2 of his employees had worked for them for a month before quitting unpaid, and denied receiving any money personally. A few years later, he was indicted on extortion charges, and his home was raided in an arms smuggling probe. In 1981, the Federal Election Commission reported that LaRouche had overspent his maximum and should pay back $112,000 in matching funds to the Treasury. The LaRouche campaign sued the FEC in Manhattan to stop it from questioning donors. Their attorney was Mayor Morgenroth of Southfield, Michigan, another former business partner of Ferris and a long-time lawyer for McMaster. Morgenroth had previously surfaced in a Miami organized crime strike force investigation of a dubious Teamster pension fund loan and a Detroit strike force probe of money allegedly being funneled from Canada into the United States. He went on to become one of the LaRouche organization's chief lawyers for the next decade. As the 1980s opened, the Justice Department mounted an unprecedented offensive against organized crime. Building trade officials, Teamster bosses, and the great godfathers of the Sun Belt, Carlos Marcello of the Gulf Coast, Santos Trafficante of Florida, Anthony Accardo of Chicago, were all swept into indictments under the bribery sting operations codenamed Brylab and Abscam. To his own followers, LaRouche supplied an extraordinary justification. Most of these people, he announced, were really good mafia. Decent men who personally disapproved of the drug traffic, but were being framed by an alliance of the federal government and a rival Zionist faction. Without LaRouche's movement to defend them, he warned, the honest trade unionists tied to the good mafia would be picked off by the Justice Department task forces like flies. Publicly, the LaRoucheans never used such language. They simply launched the Committee Against Brylab and Abscam, known as CABA, headquartered in Detroit and Houston, with Roland McMaster heading the advisory board. CABA solicited funds, offered investigators and legal research to indicted defendants, and issued pamphlets denouncing federal sting operation as the work of an undeclared war against the American system, orchestrated by the Trilateral Commission and the Eastern Establishment. New Solidarity carefully avoided ever printing the names Marcello, Trafficante, or Accardo, mentioning only that the indicted Union men, whom it described as victims of the most widespread witch hunt ever attempted against American labor. In October 1980, CABA staged a press conference in New Orleans, a city which LaRoucheans have never been active in before, that reads like nothing so much as a public gesture of support for Carlos Marcello. In March 1981, the New Jersey Teamster boss Tony Provenzano's brothers, Sammy and Nunzio, went on trial in Newark federal court for racketeering. Tony Pro was already serving a life sentence for murder. New Solidarity portrayed all three brothers as labor martyrs, and the trial as a shocking farce. That same year, another LaRouche cause was Frank Sheeran, the president of a Wilmington Teamster local, who, federal investigators believed, had driven to a Pontiac airport on the morning of July 30th, 1975, to pick up the three Genovese enforcers connected to Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. Sheeran was acquitted of 2 murders in Philadelphia, then indicted in Wilmington for racketeering. New Solidarity hailed him as a labor leader committed to growth and development. In October 1981, a federal jury convicted him on 11 counts, and he was sentenced to 18 years. LaRouche's defense of the indefensible needed something more presentable than a Carlos Marcello or a Frank Sheeran. He founded his issue in the Civil Liberties Critique of Abscam, the FBI bribery sting that ensnared members of Congress. The most useful target was Senator Harrison Williams of New Jersey, a Democrat with a distinguished legislative record who had been convicted on 9 counts in May 1981 and was now facing expulsion. The LaRouche Front Group, the National Democratic Policy Committee, through a fundraiser at New York's Statler Hilton, produced a half-hour videotape interview with him, and helped found the National Labor Committee to defend Harrison Williams. The committee's policy statement made the agenda plain. We either rise to his defense in a unified fashion across the nation, from the bottom to the top of labor, or we ourselves should not be surprised to hear the knock at the door saying, "We are next." Another beneficiary of the same posture was auto tycoon John DeLorean, indicted in 1982 on charges of cocaine trafficking. According to private investigators who worked on his defense, the LaRouche aide Jeffrey Steinberg supplied research on how the British government was supposedly out to get DeLorean. DeLorean, who was acquitted in 1984, later said that he had received information from the LaRoucheans but never paid them any money. The most explosive of these defenses, however, was the one offered to Reagan's labor secretary, Raymond Donovan. When a federal special prosecutor began looking into allegations that Donovan's firm, Schiavone Construction in New Jersey, had paid bribes to labor racketeers, a Teamster-linked attorney asked the NCLC security staff to gather information for the defense. Steinberg personally handled the work and even sent a memo on his progress to Schiavone's House counsel. Donovan was eventually indicted with 7 others, including a Genovese crime family member, in the first criminal indictment of a sitting cabinet member in American history. He resigned. After an 8-month trial in 1987, he was acquitted. Just as the LaRoucheans were leaning into the trade of defending hoodlums, their own Detroit operation was quietly going into business for itself. In 1980, the Detroit print shop Renaissance, run by NCLC local leader Kenneth Dalto, received a major infusion of capital that LaRouche later alleged came from organized crime. Dalto and his associates launched a national financial printing arm called Computype. They bought new cars, started wearing flowery shirts of the kind favored by Teamster officials, and asked their attorneys for a crash course in offshore banking. LaRouche, sensing the drift, prepared to crack down. But the Detroit faction moved first. In late October 1981, he received a letter signed by almost the entire Detroit organization and by Computype employees in Chicago, Atlanta, Houston, and Boston, 117 NCLC members in all, announcing their resignation. LaRouche responded with a flood of internal memos, blaming the split on Jewish financiers and the Anti-Defamation League. In some of these memos, he was startlingly indiscreet, mentioning the New Hampshire's vote-fixing scheme, the Southfield, Michigan advisors, and the deliberate cultivation, during the 1980 campaign, of what he called a mafia connection self-image. He warned his loyalists never to discuss it publicly because it might trigger legal action. Then, in nearly the same breath, he had his propagandists boast that they would help the Chicago Mafia rob out Dalto.
Let the creep sweat,
LaRouche wrote.
Let him run. Let him choose his hiding place.
In jokes circulated in the daily NCLC briefings, Dalto committed suicide, was killed by a car bomb, or arrived at the gates of hell wearing custom-fitted cement overshoes. In 1983, Jackie Presser finally ascended to the presidency of the Teamsters, his predecessor, Roy Williams, having resigned to begin serving a 55-year bribery sentence. The LaRoucheans seemed at last on the brink of becoming the brain trust of organized labor's hoodlum wing. Presser kept up the aggressive posture against rank-and-file reformers that had given the LaRoucheans their original opening, and after thugs violently disrupted a reformers' convention in Michigan in October of 1983, he told a Cleveland Joint Council meeting, "We should be doing more of that." Then, in mid-1984, the Los Angeles Times revealed something that startled even LaRouche. Presser had been a confidential informant for the FBI since the early 1970s. The implication was inescapable. In the long climb to the Teamster presidency, Presser had probably been keeping the Bureau happy by feeding it information on people like LaRouche himself. The LaRoucheans were not in a position to complain too loudly, since they too had been trading information to the FBI on communists, yippies, and arms merchants for nearly as long, in hopes the Bureau would overlook their own affairs. But the warm tone vanished from New Solidarity's coverage of Presser, who from then on was no longer a heroic nation builder, but simply an accused embezzler. Meanwhile, the major exposure had finally come. In early 1984, LaRouche learned that NBC's first camera was preparing a report on his organization's ties to the Reagan administration. He sued NBC for $150 million before the program even aired. Some affiliates declined to broadcast it. Many newspapers declined to repeat its allegations. Most Americans never heard that the Reagan administration had been meeting with LaRoucheans, that the LaRoucheans were in bed with racketeers, and that LaRouche's former neo-Nazi security consultants had once discussed assassinating Jimmy Carter. That fall, a jury ruled NBC had not libeled LaRouche and even awarded the network $3 million on a counterclaim, later reduced to $200,000 by the judge. On the surface, it was a defeat for LaRouche, but on a deeper level, he had won what he wanted: months of media silence during a presidential election year. With the alliance with the highest levels of the Teamsters fraying, LaRouche raised his sights from hoodlums who controlled unions to hoodlums who controlled nations. The new client was General Manuel Antonio Noriega of Panama. By 1985 and 1986, Noriega was attracting harsh scrutiny in Washington, primarily for his role in the cocaine trade. In early 1986, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina called him flatly
the head of the biggest drug trafficking operation in the Western Hemisphere.
The charge was hardly right-wing paranoia. The DEA, CIA, the Pentagon, and the State Department had been documenting Noriega's activities since the early 1970s. A House committee in 1985 had described Panama under his rule as a drug and chemical transshipment point and money laundering center. LaRouche's operative Carlos Wesley made several trips to Panama in the mid-1980s and met with a pro-Noriega group of businessmen who, he announced, represented patriotic and nationalist tendencies. Soon, the LaRoucheans had become Noriega's de facto public relations flacks in Washington. They circulated a white paper accusing Senator Helms of being the point man in a State Department conspiracy to overthrow Noriega because of the general's opposition to drugs. They claimed Noriega was actually being targeted by the real drug mafia, which had learned he was planning a military war on drugs. When Noriega forced his figurehead president to resign at gunpoint, New Solidarity portrayed it as a cause for rejoicing. When the murdered former health minister Hugo Spadafora was tortured for 5 hours in a village square, beheaded, and his remains dumped in a U.S. postal bag over the Costa Rican border, New Solidarity portrayed Spadafora as a Sandinista-style narco-terrorist. None of it was true. Spadafora had served with the Contras and had met with DEA officials only days before his murder to tell them about Noriega. In February 1988, the relationship became part of the official record. Panama's former consul general in New York, Jose Blandon, testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Terrorism and Narcotics that, in plain words,
Mr. LaRouche works for Mr. Noriega.
LaRouche's followers, Blandon said, had given Noriega intelligence reports on visiting U.S. senators before the senators arrived in Panama. The LaRouchean cover story about Spadafora's death, he added, was the official version of Noriega's G2 military intelligence. Executive Intelligence Review later more or less confirmed that LaRouche had been advising Noriega, urging him to hang tough against the State Department's offer of a quiet exit, the same delay and obfuscate strategy LaRouche himself was using against his own federal prosecutors. LaRouche responded with a rambling National Press Club speech about assassination plots and a network television announcement of a plan to colonize Mars. The Coup performance worked exactly as he intended. Opposition softened, and his followers continued raising tens of millions of dollars. But the financial side of the operation, in particular the wholesale scams involving credit cards and loan fraud, was running out of control. By LaRouche's own later count, the organization had taken in more than $200 million. It seemed possible that the end of his political career was at hand. On October 14, 1988, a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia, Alexandria Division, indicted Lyndon LaRouche Jr. and 6 associates on 13 counts. Conspiracy to commit mail fraud, including over $30 million in defaulted loans solicited from supporters, 11 counts of mail fraud, $294,000 in specific instances, and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the IRS. The indictment detailed a pattern of fraudulent loan solicitations where contributors, often elderly or vulnerable, were told loans would be repaid promptly, but were instead used to fund operations with no intent or ability to repay. On December 16, 1988, after a 4-week trial, the jury convicted all defendants on all counts. LaRouche received an aggregate 15-year sentence, 5 years concurrent on each of the 13 counts. Judge Albert V. Bryan Jr. rejected defense claim of political prosecution as errant nonsense, noting the evidence of systematic fraud was overwhelming. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit affirmed the convictions in United States v. LaRouche. LaRouche entered prison in January of 1989.
LaRouche served his time at the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota, the same facility that briefly housed the disgraced televangelist Jim Baker. The two men, by various accounts, became cordial. LaRouche worked in the prison law library, and let nothing about the experience puncture his self-image. He was, he insisted, again and again, a political prisoner. The case against him had been engineered in Washington and London. The federal prosecutors who had built the file were not officers of the law, but agents of the same forces that had murdered John F. Kennedy, hounded Jimmy Hoffa, and were now finishing the job they had started against him. The exoneration apparatus that grew up around his imprisonment was elaborate. Within weeks of the sentencing, his organization stood up the Commission to investigate human rights violations in the United States, an entity whose entire purpose was to recast the federal prosecution as a Cold War-style political persecution. Petitions were circulated in dozens of countries. Helga Zepp LaRouche traveled tirelessly to gather endorsements from sympathetic parliamentarians, clerics, retired military officers, and minor European nobility. Members of the Italian Senate signed open letters. Soviet and post-Soviet academians signed open letters. Indian and Mexican parliamentarians signed open letters. Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General who had become a kind of permanent dissident on questions of American justice, lent his name to the appeal. In 1992, from his cell in Rochester, LaRouche ran for President of the United States. It was the third of what would eventually be 8 presidential campaigns, and the first conducted entirely from federal custody. His followers handed out leaflets at polling places and shopping centers, and produced television spots in which the candidate, gray and stout in a prison-issued jumpsuit, addressed the camera with the same air of patrician displeasure he had cultivated in freedom. Federal regulators continued to pay him matching funds, on the theory that the mechanics of the Federal Election Commission had no provision for declining to subsidize a candidate simply because he was incarcerated. The campaign slogans were not about him at all. They were about a coming financial collapse, and the urgency of restoring industrial development to the industrialized West. The other transformation of those years was geopolitical. For 2 decades, LaRouche had been a militant anti-Soviet, his pamphlets full of warnings about the Kremlin, his lobbying instrumental in the early conceptual marketing of Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. The collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991 created an unexpected vacancy on his enemies list. He filled it, reflexively and almost instantly, with Britain. The Anglo-American oligarchy had always sat at the center of his conspiracy theories, now stood, in his telling, unmasked. With the Soviet Union gone, the City of London and Wall Street were free to plunder the East and impoverish the world, and the natural counterweight to that plunder was a renewed alliance among the great continental powers, above all of Russia. From his prison cell, he began producing, with the help of his economic staff, a series of papers on what he called the Productive Triangle, and, slightly later, the Eurasian Land Bridge. The vision was grand, a continent-spanning lattice of high-speed rail, nuclear power plants, water projects, and manufacturing corridors connecting Western Europe to Vladivostok, and on to Beijing. It was, in essence, an early version of what China would, in the 2010s, market to the world as the Belt and Road Initiative. To Russian intellectuals reeling under Boris Yeltsin's stock therapy reforms, administration by Western advisors, and producing almost overnight hyperinflation, the LaRouche papers offered something like a counter-program. His Schiller Institute opened a Russian language outreach. Members of the Russian Academy of Sciences began appearing on his organization's mailing list and speaking platforms. Economists like Sergei Glaziev and Stanislav Menshikov, both later to become significant figures in Vladimir Putin's policy circles, began conversing with the LaRouche apparatus.
The mechanics of how this pivot was accomplished from a federal prison deserve a moment of attention. LaRouche had visitation privileges, a typewriter, and almost a limitless supply of paper. His followers carried his drafts back to Leesburg, transcribed them, translated them, and fed them into the Executive Intelligence Review editorial pipeline. Russian language editions, produced on short budgets by small European staff, began circulating in Moscow and St. Petersburg in 1992 and 1993. At the same time, Schiller Institute delegations, unencumbered by the imprisonment of their leader, traveled to Russia conferences and briefed members of the State Duma who were looking for an alternative to the harsh medicine prescribed by the International Monetary Fund. The Russians were not fools. They understood that LaRouche was a figure of peculiar reputation in the West. They listened anyway, because the alternative they were being offered by Western advisors was producing, in their own streets, catastrophic evidence of its failure. It was a remarkable pivot, accomplished through the bars of a federal medical center, who in 1985 had warned that Soviet operatives were running American newsrooms, now wrote by 1992 of Russia as the natural civilizational partner of the United States in resisting the financial empire of London. His followers, who had spent years denouncing Mikhail Gorbachev as a tool of the trust, now spoke admiringly of patriotic Russian generals and economists who, they said, were rediscovering the Hamiltonian system of national banking. The substance of the argument is less important than the maneuver itself. LaRouche had once again demonstrated his most consistent talent: to absorb the new geopolitical movement into the unbroken structure of its own importance. In January 1994, after a little over 5 years in custody, LaRouche was released on parole. He was 61 years old, somewhat heavier, somewhat slower of step, and entirely unrepentant. His followers met him at the prison gates, drove him back to the Virginia compound, and presented him with a movement that, against the predictions of nearly every observer, had not collapsed during his imprisonment. The exoneration campaign continued. It would continue, in fact, for the next 30 years, generating petitions and pamphlets and conference resolutions long after the original prosecutors had retired and the federal judge who had sentenced him had died. But the legal exoneration never came. What came instead, in the second act of his career, was something stranger and much more enduring than any pardon: the slow ideological metabolizing of his peculiar program by a world that had begun, on certain points, to look uncomfortably like the world he had been describing all along. To understand the cultural side of the LaRouchean operation, it is necessary first to understand his wife. Helga Zepp LaRouche, born in Trier in 1948 and trained as a journalist, had married Lyndon in 1977, and within a few years had become not merely the public face of the German wing and its movement, but something closer to its spiritual director. Where Lyndon's instincts were combative and conspiratorial, Helga's were architectural. She believed in institutions, in pageantry, in the long civilizing work of choirs and conferences and beautifully printed pamphlets in 3 or 4 languages. In 1984, she founded the Schiller Institute, named for the German poet, dramatist, and aesthetic philosopher Friedrich Schiller, whose belief that humanity could be educated into freedom through beauty became the closest thing the LaRouche movement ever had to a positive program. The Schiller Institute branched from the start into music. Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, Brahms, the Negro spirituals as recovered by the great African-American sopranos of the early 20th century. These were treated by the Schillerites not as preferences, but as obligations. Choirs were established in Wiesbaden, Paris, Mexico City, Lima, Rome, and Houston. Annual conferences featured chamber recitals between political speeches. Pamphlets exhorted parents to teach their children to sight read. This was not, it should be said, an act. Helga and the staff genuinely believed that the recovery of classical music and of what they called the classical method of poetic and scientific composition was the only force capable of pulling the West back from what they saw as a cultural pit dug by Theodor Adorno, Bertolt Brecht, the Beatles, and the Frankfurt School. Out of this cultural seriousness came, in 1988, the campaign for which the Schiller Institute became most widely known beyond LaRouchean circles: the campaign to lower the international concert pitch. For most of the 20th century, the standard A above middle C had been tuned to 440 cycles per second, a pitch agreed upon by an international conference in 1939 and reaffirmed in the early 1950s. The LaRoucheans proposed to roll it back. The standard they wanted to restore was 432 cycles per second, a slightly lower frequency that had been advocated near the end of the 19th century by Giuseppe Verdi himself. Verdi had written letters complaining that the orchestral pitch in use in his lifetime was creeping ever higher, that Italian sopranos were being forced to scream when they ought to be singing, and that the great roles of the Italian operatic repertoire had been composed for a lower, warmer, more human sound. In Helga Zepp LaRouche's hands, this technical complaint became a moral crusade. The Schiller Institute drafted petitions and sought endorsements from the surviving giants of the post-war opera stage. Renata Tebaldi signed. Carlo Bergonzi signed. Piero Capuccilli signed. So did a number of conductors and voice teachers across Italy and Germany. In April of 1988, the Institute convened a conference in Milan, whose stated purpose was to present the case for the lower tuning to the Italian music world, and whose actual purpose, as is often the case with LaRouche events, was also to present the LaRouches to a room full of distinguished people. By the following year, a bill had been introduced in the Italian Senate proposing to make the lower pitch the legal standard for state opera houses and conservatories. The bill never passed, but it generated months of genuine debate in the European musical press, much of it conducted in deliberate ignorance of who was funding the campaign. The argument the Schiller Institute made in support of the lower tuning was twofold. The technical argument was that human voices, particularly the voices of trained sopranos, are physically built around a register break that falls at a certain pitch, and that the modern higher tuning forced singers to take that break in the wrong place, damaging their instruments and shortening their careers. There was real evidence for this claim, gathered from voice teachers and laryngologists, and the Institute's Manual on the Rudiments of Tuning and Registration, published in 1992, remains a serious contribution to the literature on classical singing technique, whatever one thinks of the politics of the publishers. The second argument was metaphysical. The lower tuning, Helga argued, was the natural pitch of the great compositions of the classical tradition, and to perform those compositions at a higher tuning was a small, daily act of vandalism against the achievements of European civilization. This was where the Verdi pitch campaign opened out into the larger Schillerite project of what was always called the Classical Renaissance. The Institute proposed nothing less than a return to the aesthetic principles of the Italian and German Renaissances, of Plato, of Nicholas of Cusa, of Leibniz, of Schiller, and the young Beethoven. Romanticism, in their telling, had been the long downhill detour from these principles, and modernism had been the bottom of the slope. The 12-tone music of Schoenberg, the prose of Joyce, the theater of Brecht, the painting of Picasso, the philosophy of the existentialists, and the popular music of the Anglo-American mass market were all, in the Schiller Institute analysis, instruments of cultural warfare, deliberately deployed against the populations of the West to render them incapable of clear thought, civic action, or scientific creativity. The technical work that grew out of the pitch campaign was, by any honest measure, serious. The Manual on the Rudiments of Tuning and Registration, produced under the supervision of a committee that included practicing musicians and laryngologists, ran to more than 400 pages in its first volume alone. It drew on archival research in Italian libraries, on interviews with retired singers of the war-era Milan and Rome companies, and on technical measurements of the acoustic properties of historical instruments. It argued, with citations, that Bach and Mozart had written for keyboards tuned lower than the modern standard, that Verdi had designed his operas for a pitch at least a half step below what the Metropolitan Opera used in the 1980s, and that the steady upward creep of orchestral tuning across the 20th century had been a silent disaster for the health of the human voice. None of these claims were original to LaRouche. What was original was the idea of churning them into a legislative and diplomatic campaign. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the Institute kept up an extraordinary cultural calendar. Choirs sang Mozart's Requiem and Beethoven's Ninth in Paris, Berlin, Manhattan, and Lima. Conferences gathered classical musicians in Bad Schwalbach to discuss tuning, registration, and the politics of beauty. Young Schillerites were trained in elementary music theory and the geometric constructions of Greek mathematics, in the dictation of Italian opera. A whole generation of LaRouche youth movement recruits learned to harmonize Bach chorals as part of their political education. To outsiders, particularly hostile outsiders, this looked like a particularly elaborate form of cult conditioning. To the participants, it looked like Plato's Republic had finally been given a choir. The campaign itself outlived its initial flurry. The Italian bill failed, but the argument became a permanent feature of the classical music debate. Through the 1990s and into the 2010s, Schiller Institute choirs performed Handel's Messiah, Mozart's Requiem, and Beethoven's Missa Solemnis at the lower pitch in churches and concert halls from New York to Lima to Berlin. LaRouche emerged from prison into a Virginia compound in the rolling hills outside Leesburg, where his followers had purchased and renovated a sprawling estate that served, depending on the day, as residence, conference center, publishing house, intelligence shop, and salon. From this base, he ran for president again in 1996, and again in 2000, and again in 2004. The campaigns produced occasional flashes of newsworthy support. Democratic primary returns in the high single digits in scattered states. A flurry of complaints from state party chairs who could not figure out how to keep him off the ballot, but they were no longer the headline-grabbing operations of the early 1980s. The political mainstream had learned to look past him. He had become, in a phrase he would have despised, a fixture. The intellectual project of those years moved from electoral policies towards what he had called a new Bretton Woods. The 1971 collapse of the gold standard, in his telling, had cut Western economies loose from physical reality and churned them into casinos in which paper claims on paper claims compounded faster than any real economy could support. The eventual reckoning, he insisted year after year, would arrive as a deflationary financial collapse worse than 1929 and a hyperinflationary explosion of fiat currencies worse than Weimar, simultaneously. When the long credit boom finally unraveled in 2007 and 2008, he claimed vindication and demanded an emergency international conference to write down the world's derivative books and reorganize the global monetary system around productive infrastructure investment. The conference never happened. The financial system was stabilized, after a fashion, by the very central banks LaRouche had spent 4 decades denouncing. He took the rescue itself as further evidence of the conspiracy. In the early 2000s, he launched the LaRouche Youth Movement, a recruitment effort directed at college-age students. The young recruits, often in their early 20s, were deployed to airports, transit stations, and college campuses, where they set up folding card tables stacked with pamphlets and confronted passers-by with the provocative posters and rhetorical traps about the Bush administration, the Iraq War, the Federal Reserve, and the British monarchy. They were also drilled with great seriousness in classical Greek geometry, in Bach, four-part harmony, and in the curriculum of Helga's Schiller Institute. The movement's recruitment style was abrasive enough that several universities barred its members from the grounds, and intense enough that critics, including the families of some recruits, began to describe it openly as a high-control group. Through the second half of the 2000s and into the 2010s, LaRouche's foreign policy increasingly converged on what was in fact happening in international affairs. He had always advocated continental development corridors. China, after 2013, began building exactly such corridors under the banner of the Belt and Road Initiative. He had always advocated for a renewed Russian alliance with the great civilizational states of Eurasia. Vladimir Putin's government, after roughly 2007, began advocating something not unrecognizably similar. He had always insisted that the post-1971 dollar system was a temporary aberration that the BRICS countries would eventually overturn. The BRICS bloc, beginning to take institutional shape in the same years, gave him a vocabulary that sounded uncannily like his own. None of this means LaRouche caused any of these developments. It does mean that, after 40 years of being treated as a crank for predicting them, he could be forgiven for taking a small, dark satisfaction in their arrival. By the middle of the 2010s, he was visibly aging. Public appearances grew shorter and more infrequent. Helga increasingly carried the public face of the work, presiding over the Schiller Institute conferences in Berlin, New York, and Frankfurt, traveling to Beijing and Moscow, and conducting webcasts that drew small but devoted international audiences. LaRouche himself produced fewer of the marathon written essays that had been his trademark, and more of his communications were issued in interview form, with the younger associates posing the questions and shaping the prose. He continued to insist, until the end, that the financial crisis of 2008 had only been postponed, that the British monarchy was the malign force behind every ill of the modern world, and that the salvation of civilization lay in a Eurasian alliance for physical economic development. On February the 12th, 2019, Lyndon Hermile LaRouche, Jr. died at his home in Round Hill, Virginia. He was 96 years old. The obituaries were respectful in tone, exhaustive in length, and, in the great mainstream papers, almost universally hostile in substance. The New York Times reviewed the prosecutions, the conspiracy theories, the anti-Semitism, the Teamster connections, and cult-like organizations, and concluded that he had been one of the strangest political entrepreneurs in modern American history. The Schiller Institute issued a long appreciation, in 3 languages, that placed him in a tradition running from Plato to Leibniz to Friedrich Schiller, and treated his criminal conviction as an unjust footnote to a life of statesmanship. Both, in their way, were accurate. He had been all of these things at once. After his death, the movement fragmented, as such movements always do when their founder is also the boss. Helga Zepp LaRouche kept the Schiller Institute going from Wiesbaden, sustained by European choirs and the loyal cadre, and a thickening relationship with policy intellectuals in Beijing and Moscow. In the United States, the Political Action Committee, LaRouche PAC, increasingly run by a generation of activists who had joined under the LaRouche youth movement, kept up the pamphleteering and the campus organizing and the perennial campaigns for federal office. In 2022, Diane Sarr, a longtime LaRouche organizer and former cellist, ran for the United States Senate seat from New York, qualified for the ballot through a vast petition drive, and received a small but visible share of the vote. The 1980s machine was gone. What remained was a network rather than an army. By 2026, the various Schillerite and LaRouchean institutions are smaller, older, and quieter than they were at their peak, but they are still there. The question of LaRouche's intellectual estate is complicated by the fact that so much of what he said was, strictly speaking, unoriginal. That, in the end, was the achievement and the warning of his career. He had built an organization small enough that the political mainstream could afford for decades to pretend that it did not exist, and a body of ideas durable enough that, once the mainstream finally turned to confront the world that he had been describing, the ideas were already inside the conversation. He had been a confidence man, a propagandist, a scholar, a felon, a husband, a candidate, a prisoner, a teacher of choirs, and an advisor to dictators. He had been, depending on the angle of inspection, an embarrassment, a danger, and a prophet. He had been, above all, the boss of an enterprise that outlived him, in scattered and quieter form, into a century whose troubles he had spent his life rehearsing.